Thank you very much for coming to Morning Coffee. Our topic today is why our stories matter. We're, of course, coming to you from ACC Senior Services. Just a couple of plugs first. There are still some places at the California State Railroad Museum tours that are coming up on Monday, June 12th, 9:30 to 12:30. And that's going to be something that ACC is going to offer all summer, close to 10 tours. And also a plug for our cookbook. And one of the reasons that we ended up picking the theme today, and it's called The Foods We Share, the Stories We Tell. We have been collecting what we thought were going to be 150 recipes. I think we're well over 200 now. But it's not just the recipes that tell the story, it's the stories behind the recipes about cooking that I think you're going to enjoy so much. We're going to be doing pre-sales pretty soon, so look here for more announcements. And now I'd like to introduce, I'm going to call my friends. Ray Tatar first, who I've known the longest. I met him when he first arrived in town. How many years ago, Ray?
A couple of centuries ago.
And at the time, I was involved with two very small theater companies, one an improv company and one the Exchange for the Performing Arts. And I worked with Bob Locke, someone he knew was with. And he was with the California Arts Council as manager of the Organizational Grants Program. He was also the founding director of the Los Angeles Theater Alliance, so his reputation, I knew him from that beforehand, and the Magic Theater, and created the Sacramento Area Regional Theater Alliance, SARTA, which I was involved in early on in the newsletter, and also the Sacramento Theater League. Ray holds a master's in directing from UC Berkeley, and in the early 1900s produced State of the Arts, which was an award-winning cable television show, and now he's doing Arts Alive for Access Channel 17, Channel 18, once a week.
Yes.
So you can see him. But he's also, and this is where my heart goes out to him, he's the founder of the California Stage and the R20, well, with Dennis Wilkerson, the R25 Arts Complex. And we have people in the audience. Joy and I, Brad, is with the Sacramento Poetry Center, have used that space. So it is a wonderful place with 3 theaters and maybe, 8 theater companies, artists, visual artists, writing programs and others. It's a fantastic place at Art and 25 in Midtown. He'll plug later some programs that are coming up there. There was just one on Shakespeare, but he's got radio theater as well. And again, it's a space where I've had many nonprofits over the years. And just recently, he wangled me into being the treasurer, I think, of the board, which I'm not so sure you should trust me.
I'm sorry, Maryellen.
And I have to tell you, I'm going to introduce Brad Buchanan. He's a relatively new person in my life, even though I have known of him for years and years. We are alleyway neighbors. He lived there for a year, and I didn't realize it. Some of my really dear friends, Alice Levine and Rich Haroon. So his poetry, fiction, and scholarly articles appeared in nearly 200 journals. He's published book-length collections of poems as well as academic books. He'll talk more about them. He gifted me his most recent book. I want to thank him. Indict the author of Affection, Affectation, and Catachresis, if I get that one right, in Hamlet, which I'm hoping to give to Ray at some point because he's also a devotee. And the other thing, then he'll talk more about it. He suffered through multiple health crises, including treatment for a rare form of lymphoma, a stem cell transplant, temporary vision loss, and now chronic graft versus host disease. So I'm really delighted they're going to be sharing. As for me, most of you already know me from Morning Coffee. I've been around ACC now for a while. A couple of years anyway, and you've all heard my stories. I interject them, and I'll be interjecting them today. Usually the stories that I like to share are about my Hollywood child actress mother, my vagabond father, who both made antiques for a living and was on the road from literally from 8 to 10. And then my early life growing up in Sacramento in public housing, my discovery that was really important to me that my family was Jewish at 10 that I didn't know before. and the work that I do collecting the stories of others. And the ones that I'm the most interested with is the stories of people whose stories have either been erased or they have been hidden. And to paraphrase Joan Didion, who was in the house next door to Brad, am I right? Just one door down?
Couple of doors down, yeah.
Couple of doors down. I tell myself stories in order to live. So I'd like to give each of them some time to talk about whatever topic they want to on the idea of our stories matter. Ray first, and then Brad, and then we're just going to have a conversation. If you have a story in the audience that you'd like to share, Marge Tarbell is in the audience, and she will give you a microphone, and we'll have you join us. So Ray.
Thank you, Maryellen. Thanks for that introduction. That's wonderful, and I admire what you do in the community, and I think it's the most wonderful thing. Thank you so much. Well, I wanted to talk about stories about my family, actually, because it is the first book that Maryellen said, well, why don't you publish that? And I said, well, she said, I have someone who will help you. And she turned me on to a guy named Lawrence Fox, who whipped it together and made it look really wonderful and helped me edit it and make it a strong story. Old stories about my family had a lot to do with what I am. We're a family of storytellers and story makers. My grandparents were doing community theater in the old country, and then my parents, they did a play together in the Polish theater in 1936. That's how they met. My wife and I met doing a play at the Old Eagle Theater in Sacramento a long time ago. And now I run a theater called California Stage, a theater company in Midtown, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. There are many stories in those experiences, and I'm excited about what we're doing now. I just push ahead into the next thing. We have a wonderful senior program which utilizes actors who can't remember a whole script of Shakespeare, but they can read Shakespeare and they can read new plays, and that's what they do. It's basically we're doing radio dramas of the old time of radio dramas, rewritten and upgraded to kind of the times, and it's an exciting service. And this next week we're doing a couple of radio dramas that are exceptionally good murder mysteries. I grew up with plays and stories, as I said, but it seems natural to be a key direction in my family, my brothers and me. We have a kind of a sense of driving force in story making and reading stories. I mean, if you come into my house and go upstairs and you go into the room there, you can see that there's a whole cover box of books and just a bunch of stories, one whole, I don't know, what, Susan, 200 or something like that. At any rate, I'm very fond. On another scale, I think that stories play a central role in the formation and the maintenance of family bonds. And I mean, not just my family, I'm talking about intimate, memorable, and wild and crazy connections that all of your families may have. And they can be made into stories. I am happy to say that writing and working with family members on this story about the various struggles in our family, about positive things, it can be somewhat daunting. I found that the struggle is worth it. In reading the reminiscences, I found that the richer the detail, the greater the emotional connection to those moments in me and in some of my readers. By weaving the emotional content of yourself and others into a story you're telling, you deepen the reader's experience. It prompts readers and listeners to further compare those events to their own lives. There was a major study done at Harvard recently about the passing of family stories down to children, and it was shown, and I quote, unequivocally shown that stories are the single greatest predictor of a child's happiness. That's a heavy statement. I also believe that stories have a social function, that family stories are published for the general public. They can be far more than entertainment. They can give us perspective on our lives. This book, the one I was talking about earlier, is is a book of stories about my family, the Tatar family. It reaches back about 110 years. And it's an interesting book because it's all I could know. Their family plot goes back to about 1740s, but these are where I could still get people living when I started to write this, who really had family stories down tight. On both sides of my family, family stories are very important. They vary from one about my grandfather's treasure, which is supposedly buried in an island in the middle of the Vistula River. It's never been found. Of course, we haven't really looked for it, have we, Susan? There's the one about the tragic death of my grandfather, who died in the same hospital at the same time my mother was being born. So you have mourning, you have family mourning, and many other issues that you can put into story, and it becomes part of your history and connection. These are things that mark the reality of every story. When my grandmother remarried, all the photos of her first husband were destroyed. So she never knew. She had a lifelong mourning of a father she never knew. She couldn't even visualize him because there were no photos. One day, 40 years later, my mother tells the story. We see the hospital where he died, and we go in there, and he runs into an older nurse, and my mother tells a story, and the nurse says, "Come into my office." She pulls a file cabinet open. She goes into the file. She pulls out the only picture of her father on his deathbed. My mother, thank you. In this book, I have woven the family stories of the events and personal experience during the World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. These are significant stories to tell. And luckily, we started our research when some of the elders in my family are still alive, and I worked with them and involved them in it made stories much clearer and sometimes astonishingly poignant. The description of my grandmother's death and burial ended up being much longer than I thought, and I learned that the Poles traditionally make the death and burial of a loved one a series of major events lasting up to 5 days. I also learned about perspectives and how they can vary, how you can use for the good of your book. There was a story pertaining to my father's catching a record-sized muskie in a Wisconsin lake. I asked each of my 3 brothers how big the fish was. I got separate answers, but they were all at that event. They were there. They saw the fish. Later, while searching for possible pictures for the book, I found a photograph of my 5'2" father struggling to keep that 3-foot fish in the air. Did I use that picture? Did I use it? No, I got a picture of him and his fishing partner holding the fish between them on a big pole. Well, if my father was a doofus, I probably would have said, "I'll take the first picture," but I was wrong. We used a second photo because I wanted my father to look triumphant, and he was. Okay, where should such a book like this go? Well, all my relatives on 3 continents loved it. It's in Evanston and the Chicago libraries. Both books have sections about immigrant families, since it's about Polish immigrants. It was wanted by various Polish community service organizations across the United States. And the Sacramento Library has a special books section for books written by local folks. So if your writing becomes famous, you may get a portrait there in the library as well. They have a special place for people like Joan Didion and Herb Caen. Nice people. So a couple of years ago, my wife and I took a trip down the Nile River But before we did, we visited the library in Alexandria. It's the oldest library in the world, 2,000-year-old library. My brother suggested that I offer the book to them. I thought, no. I actually had a copy with me. They accepted it with handshakes and cameras and photographs and all kinds of things. So you never know where your book's going to end up unless you try. So I'd like to end by saying, at the end of a book like mine, there must not be a wrap-up or a resolve a central conflict. It doesn't. But there needs to be some form of completeness. And I think the reader should get up with a feeling that this is a complete story rather than a finished story. What kind of complete with what you might write is up to you. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Ray. And there's a lot that I'll ask him later before I'm going to Ray, but you know me, I always have to put those little facts of history. The library at Alexandria burned and was restarted.
That's right, it burned down.
And it was restarted by a Sacramento woman who was in her 80s who decided that her life work.
That's right.
Remember?
Absolutely.
So there's always a connection.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to turn it over to Brad.
Interesting, I guess, to share is my maternal grandfather was a wonderful radio host, a cheerful personality. He loved to tell stories about golf, but the one thing he didn't talk about was life in Belfast. He had no stories to tell or didn't want to tell any stories about life in Belfast. And I couldn't figure it out. I was like, why does he not want to talk about it? So I did a little bit of sleuthing, and this was after all of my grandparents passed. I became kind of the unofficial family historian. And so my uncle, so my mother's brother, son of the Belfast parents, sent me diaries from my grandfather that he had kept, especially during his illness. He died of complications of leukemia, and he also had lung cancer and heart problems and so forth. But anyway, so I put together the dates of when they came to Canada, because I'm from Canada. And my mother was actually born during World War II in Belfast when the Germans were bombing Belfast. And I realized that my grandfather had tried to get the family out of Northern Ireland before the war and failed. He didn't get his ducks in a row. Immigration was complicated. I think he wanted to come to the US first, and there were problems there. So Canada was kind of his backup plan, as it probably was for a lot of Irish, Scots immigrants. But anyway, and he'd also gotten his wife pregnant, and so she was not up to a sea voyage before the war. So he had to sit in Belfast while the Germans were bombing the shipyards, because Belfast was a shipbuilding center. He was also an air warden who his entire job was to get people from their homes into subterranean shelters. And his own wife, my maternal grandmother, refused to go. She said, no, if I'm going to die from a German bomb, I'm going to do it in my own home. So she kept my mother, who was a toddler at the time, and my uncle with her under the staircase. She thought that was the safest place to be while the Germans were bombing the Belfast shipyards. So having reconstructed all of this, I realized why my grandfather wouldn't tell these stories, because he felt guilty and probably ashamed that he hadn't managed to get his family to safety in time, because obviously, no Canadian cities were getting bombed by the Germans, and he had wanted to immigrate before the war and not managed to do it. And just to imagine the feeling of panic and helplessness of sitting there in an air raid shelter while your wife and children were elsewhere, wondering if a bomb was going to get them. No wonder he didn't want to talk about that. That was a story I had to kind of reconstruct from bits and pieces, and I did end up writing some poems about that. One of them is called "The Secret History of My Grandparents," because here are these Irish people who love to talk, who love to tell stories, who love to tell jokes, anecdotes, and so forth, and yet there was silence on this incredible history. So anyway, that's something that I've tried to remedy to some extent. Um, my father recently became a widower. My mother died of complications of lymphoma. Blood cancer seems to run in my family. Um, so last year, I gave my father something called Storyworth, and I'm sorry if I'm plugging a product that, I'm not being paid here to do that, but it was the greatest gift this man has ever gotten in his life because um, he had incentive to write stories about his life. And they put it into a nice package. It's very easy. He couldn't deal with the online interface, but I could. So I plugged in his stories. And a year later, we had a nice bound volume. And he's doing it again this year, unsolicited. Um, I've told him, well, I haven't bought you Storyworth this year. You're going to have to wait. You have to wait another year to see these things in print. But anyway, he's been retired for many years. And with my mother gone, he is really taking stock of things and thinking, okay, I want to pass on some of the experiences I've had. Again, a lot related to golf. It runs in the family. Um, so anyway, stories, as Ray has said, and Ray really kind of inspired me to delve into this aspect of my own family life that I hadn't planned to talk about. But while we're on the subject, yeah, like I find that the impulse to tell stories to one's children is extremely strong. But often when you want to tell the story, they're not ready to listen. So that's why it's important to write it down. And this will move to my next topic, really, which is writing as a healing enterprise, writing as something we do to try to recover from catastrophic events of whatever type. In my case, I've had a catastrophic illness, well, actually two catastrophic illnesses, and a third that has proved problematic, as Marianne has pointed out. I still have a chronic illness, graft versus host disease, which was a consequence of a stem cell transplant that nearly killed me in 2016 when I had an acute case of graft versus host disease. Um, so I've had to try to use writing and narrative to make sense of what has happened to me, because otherwise it just feels like the misfortunes of Job, suffering that somehow has been meted out to me by fate or something. And how do you make meaning of it unless you tell stories to shape it into some kind of narrative that makes some degree of sense? So, yeah, as Maryellen has pointed out, I've done quite a bit of writing. I published a medical memoir also called Living with Graft versus Host Disease, because I realized that there were no patient narratives about this disease. Um, it's not a well-known disease. It's artificial. In other words, no one naturally has graft versus host disease. It's a consequence of a stem cell transplant, and therefore is kind of a very niche illness. And people do a double take when you tell them, yeah, well, yeah, I've survived 2 types of blood cancer, but guess what? I'm still ill. I still have an illness that I need to manage. Um, so yeah, so probably the most immediate and important writing I did was during my initial cancer treatments. Well, actually, before it even, when I started to feel these lumps along my jawline in 2014. So I'm going to share a couple of poems that I've written from the book that I wrote. And the book is called "The Scars Aligned: A Cancer Narrative." So I took the cliche of the stars being aligned, like fates have ordained something, and turned it into the scars aligned by human means, right? We take the scars, and I do have physical scars on my body from cancer treatments and whatever. But is it possible to shape them into something like a meaningful pattern to align them into a narrative? And that's what I did in that book. And starting with a poem I wrote before I was diagnosed. and I'll just recite it quickly here. It's called the differential diagnoses. And that means the list of possible things you could have wrong with you when the doctors don't know, right? You might have leukemia, you might have lymphoma, or you might just have some weird skin condition that's producing these lumps. They just couldn't tell until the fourth biopsy. Anyway, here's the poem. The alphabet, once scattered throughout my blood, has metastasized, producing a poem. Cancer and its early equivocations, a subcutaneous haiku sequence, individual nodules linked mainly by their distinctive form, perhaps only the harmless conceit of a overly active imagination, but something in me wants the capital T cell truth to be spelled out accurately at last in all its strange malignancy. Give me straight talk in off rhyme and halting measure, or an epigram even with murderous closure. So that was before I was diagnosed. I knew I had something wrong. Nobody wanted to call it cancer, but I knew I had cancer. I just didn't know what type. I didn't know how serious it would be. So 6 months later, roughly, I finally got a diagnosis. So I knew I had T-cell lymphoma. I knew I had T-cell lymphoma, but they didn't know whether to treat it or not. It was that strange, and they ended up just calling it Brad's lymphoma because it was a T-cell lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's, not otherwise specified. It looked like some kind of subcutaneous lymphoma, like under the skin, but it was not just a subcutaneous lymphoma because it created a tumor in my left lung that ended up bursting. And the next poem is the one I wrote after it burst, and I ended up in the hospital. And the poem is called Emergency. Coughing up blood rich enough to make the tubercular poets jealous, I sat spitting bright jam in a bucket while my wife ran 3 red lights to bring me here to the ER, just in time for my body to bore the important machine to which it is now attached. Death has been exchanged for an itch in my arm and the fondest wish not to be touched. So as I was sitting in the ER, I wrote the poem that then fit into the narrative of my illness. And somehow, knowing that I was writing part of a narrative made that experience seem more manageable and survivable. One of my serious challenges in all this was I'm extremely squeamish, or I was. I think I'm less squeamish now because I've had so many pokes and prods. I've seen my own blood come pouring out of my body in various ways. I used to faint at the sight of blood. I used to, faint. I still might faint actually if they needed to poke me in the arm. I have a port line now that they go in to draw blood from. But anyway, I would go into each medical encounter thinking, okay, am I going to faint or not? So I needed some sort of like inner resource to allow me to think, okay, one day all of this is going to make sense. One day this is all going to form a meaningful narrative that finishes with me surviving. Like there's going to be a happy ending to this story. Somehow, I don't know how, but somehow there will be. Even though I thought as blood was coming up from my burst lung in large amounts, I thought, oh, I'm simply going to die. But turns out I didn't. And so the story could continue, and it did continue through to a stem cell transplant, where my brother was my donor. And of course, that brought out all kinds of feelings. When someone you've known virtually your entire life, my brother's a year younger than I am. The narrative I drew upon there was a wonderful British film called Chariots of Fire. And so we had talked about it. It was one of our favorite movies, and it kind of, in a strange way, shaped our lives. My brother became an excellent middle distance runner. He got a scholarship to go to North Carolina to run track. And there he studied international studies. He went abroad. He studied in Paris, and has spent a life in with international NGOs fighting against hunger and this, fighting for the rights of the disabled in countries where they don't have any services for disabled people at all. Anyway, so it set him on a certain course, and it also set me on a course because I became a tremendous Anglophile. These young, beautiful British men running on the beach. Oh my gosh, how lovely! And anyway, I ended up studying modern British literature, which is roughly the time period that's covered in the film, and falling in love with a certain aesthetic anyway that film strongly represented. One of the chapters in the book about graft versus host disease is called "My Brother's Chariot." Sorry. This is the point in the narrative where I have trouble because the feelings get a little strong. But anyway, so maybe I'll share one more poem from the book that that kind of helps to bring the narrative up to date. And it's the last poem in The Scars Aligned. And it's a poem I wrote before my transplant as a promise to myself that I would survive, that I would publish the book of poetry that I had been working on, and that I would give a poetry reading where I would read from that book. And so the poem is called The Reading. Tonight I will read to you from a book to prove that I have survived all this. More than the usual intimacy of poetry binds us here. This is the moment when the cure becomes official and worthwhile, when all that silence and darkness sees its patience embodied and multiplied. You are its essence and reward. Words imprisoned, despairing, are set free as we speak. Rip the folded pages of my illness open. Let the wounds breathe your trust. You don't know how much you were missed. So that's the poem that ends the book, and for me, was my promise to myself that, that reading would actually occur, and that's why I end all my readings with that poem to kind of close the loop and finish the story in a way that brings it up to the present day, right? So maybe that's where I should just stop.
The question from the audience was, did he go back to Ireland?
Yeah, I've been back to Ireland once when I was 10 years old. It's on the top of my bucket list to go back now that my health has improved somewhat and the pandemic is, I guess, officially over according to the World Health Organization. Gee, I survived the pandemic. What do you think? What do you make of that? I didn't think I would. So yeah, I've been back once. And I have a story to tell about that one visit too. We were supposed to stay in a Belfast hotel, and our relatives in Ireland said, don't stay there, come stay with us. And sure enough, there was a bombing in Belfast during the time where we would otherwise have been there. There's a hotel in Belfast that's the most bombed hotel in human history. I don't know how it remains open. But I guess these days the tensions have eased a great deal. But and my grandfather, who would not talk about his experiences during the war, used to say, "Oh yeah, Ireland, it's a great place to be from," as opposed to a good place to actually be, And I sort of feel that way too. Mind you, I watch all kinds of, I love the show Dairy Girls, for instance, about the Catholic schoolgirls in Northern Ireland who are trying to, negotiate the political minefield of life there and still grow up and be healthy human beings if that's possible. So, yeah, I do intend to go back as soon as I'm able to do so. This is definitely an Irish cap. Yeah. If you go on Amazon and look for Irish caps, you'll find something a lot like this one. Yeah.
So Brett, it's hard to follow that, let me tell you. Part of me wants to say thank you very much for coming. We're going home now. But this is the part where I do want to have a conversation so that and any of us can ask any other person a question. Same thing from the audience if there was something that inspired you. But I do want to say something that I found interesting that's a counterpoint to Brad, and that is that even though I've had breast cancer and was a caregiver for my husband who was really ill, I went through my parents. I have never written about that aspect. And I don't know why, I just have never addressed it. But it was when I had cancer that was going through a treatment that I actually wrote my first book that had my name on it. Because up to that point I had been a ghostwriter, right? So I was always writing under somebody else's name. And I found that that was incredibly cathartic to get out of my illness and to not think about it. I just remember going through it. It's like, if this is going to kill me, then why waste a moment? And if it's not going to kill me, then why waste a moment? And I was the most productive. And it was also when I got the most engaged with hearing other people's stories. And I didn't want to hear about other people's health issues either. That was like the furthest thing from my, from my mind to do it. However, I did start writing a lot, and this isn't a plug for this, and I think this will create a thing. I wrote a book, the most recently is called Extracts, and it is mostly true stories with a sprinkling of recipes. And this will be a question. You've got brothers, and I think sisters. My brothers say that there isn't a story that I tell about my parents or about them that is true. That I have somehow fictionalized it. And my view is, my favorite movie is Rashomon, where you can tell a story and 3 different people will see that story in a different aspect. So I'm going to ask, my first question to you guys will be, the stories that you tell, how hard was it to extract it from the people that you got? And how did the stories differ from each other?
Ray, do you want to?
Sure. Well, I told you about the fish. The fish that started here. It actually was fish this long, and it got to be that big or that big, And it is. I think I wanted to say, that a number of people have talked to my brothers about other issues in our family, and they all have different points of view. Of course, my family, each son is born 5 years after the next son. And so they were brought up in different ways in different places. And so they're very, very different. My brother Fred is just so different. And so I can ask him to tell a story about my mother, and then he will come up with something totally different than I visualized or remember that event happening. He had just a different point of view from, I guess, his life experience. So that's an amazing thing you have to hold on to. I didn't want to. I wanted to go and say, "No, you're wrong. This is what happened," which is a good Polish thing to do, but I didn't do it.
And did you have a comment, Brad?
Well, I was going to go back to what you said about, having a cancer diagnosis that made you sort of motivated to write under your own name and, leave your mark, so to speak. There's a famous quotation from some British writer who said, being under sentence of death concentrates the mind wonderfully.
Marquez.
What's that?
I think it's Gabriel Marquez.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, I think the possibility that one might die fairly soon, which is, I think, part of what's motivating my father to finally get his stories down on paper, and what was motivating me to write, in the emergency room, was just like, well, let me tell something. And this finally, you can finally work Hamlet back in, right? Because at the end of the play, he says, "I am dead, Horatio. Um, you know, transmit my truth to the unsatisfied, and in this harsh world, draw thy breath in pain to tell my story." He wants his story to be told, and he's charging Horatio, his friend, with the task of telling the story, report my truth to the unsatisfied. So I think that's a really fundamental human impulse, is to face death honestly and say, well, if I do die, at least I have told a certain type of story uh, that's important to me and that I want people to think about, to remember me by. So that's where I was gonna go. But I've already talked about how difficult it was to extract any kind of stories
Right.
from my grandparents, or parents for that matter. Like, my parents were completely uninterested in their origins too. They were kind of classic, in a way, like second generation immigrants who were just like, oh, we're in Canada, it's a lovely place, let's try our best to fit in here, and take advantage of the opportunity that our parents have managed to procure for us. And they barely thought at all about the old country. It was just the old country, and now we're in a new country. And those old stories, those old problems, especially when they're involved with bloody, religious conflict and such.
How long did it take to go from one to the other, U.S. to Canada?
So the question from the audience was, how long did it take you to basically migrate from Canada to the United States? That's a question to Brad.
Oh, well, there's a bit of a story there too. I came to the U.S. in 1995 to go to graduate school in the Bay Area. I married an American citizen, but for a long time I was like, I don't really want to be an American citizen. Part of me was like, no, I'm a Canadian, darn it, and I'll stay that way. Until a certain president, I don't want to, presume on anyone's political beliefs. I'll just say, when a certain president was elected, I said, okay, well, I promised actually beforehand, if that person gets elected, I will get my citizenship so I could vote for him for re-election. And so, indeed, that person did get elected, and I put in my citizenship request. And that was almost 20 years after we'd gotten married. So at that point, it was a very easy, simple process. Because clearly I wasn't in a big rush. I'd gotten my green card well before that. So anyway,
The island?
what's that?
Did they put you on the island? Or they always put all these newcomers on the island?
No. This was all in San Francisco. So I just had to wait in some really long lines outside the San Francisco, immigration office, which is one of the most impacted, I think, in the entire country.
So if I can add a point too about people's reticence about telling stories, and this was especially true when we would ask people for even recipes or their stories. Elaine Korn and I did a project for quite a few years called We Are Where We Eat, where we were capturing the stories of everyday people, and it was like, I don't have a story to tell. And then people would you'd sit down and you would get that one question that would just open them up, and the stories were pouring through them. But what I'm reminded of, and I'm going to talk about, Bob Good was a psychology professor at Sac State that I knew, that was part of the academic senate. He started the Renaissance Society, which is a partner. Mm-hmm. And he would never talk about his war experiences. And I know that he was at Pearl Harbor. And and would never talk about it. 30 years I tried to get him to talk about his war experiences. Wouldn't. It was true of, I had very many Japanese friends. I'd ask them about their time if they had spent in Tule Lake or in the internment, didn't want to talk about it. My parents, I could go through everything of, no, I don't want to, talk about it. And then one day I found Bob we used to have what's called a faculty cafeteria. It's where he was with other faculty, and everyone there was a vet of World War II. And it wasn't until they got that special group that they started opening up about the trauma that they had undergone. and started revealing more and more. And so then Bob started on a story project of capturing the stories of Vietnam vets. Later, James Scott's done it. If I remember, Viet House, right? Was
Vet
it?
House. Yeah, actually, Vet House is what our first people to come and say, "Can we have a space at the theater?" You bet.
Right. So, so I guess I'm saying, and I just have recently a family secret that I can't reveal. Found out that there are lots of family secrets.
Of course.
But I would like to have you address, how do you encourage people who are fearful of telling their story, that it's time to share what my aunt called the bitter with the better, of trying to get that down?
Well,
Or is it groups like you do with AWP where it's a really safe environment?
Well, that's what I was going to talk a little bit about. Is I facilitate writing workshops for various entities, primarily cancer centers or cancer patient, survivor, caregiver groups, where we only offer positive feedback on people's writing. So we don't say, this could be a little punchier, or how about the punctuation here? We just say anything that gets written in this group is treated as a healing activity, or a newborn baby, where we just say, isn't it wonderful something new has been brought in the world, not that kid's head is a little funny looking. So that, and we offer prompts and opportunities to write about ordinary topics, but also potentially transformative experiences. We try to use the Amherst Writers and Artists method, which is a way of just creating a very, very safe space where people know they can share their words and have them be treated with respect and encouragement. And eventually, the stories tend to come out in one shape or another. Often they come out just in dribs and drabs, or in a list, or in a little journal entry or something. Writing in any form doesn't have to be in a story form. And honestly, a story is probably the hardest thing to write, because a story needs to have events that are causally connected to each other, right? And there also needs to be the presumption of an audience who's paying attention, like the Vietnam vets, right? They probably don't presume that everyone younger than them wants to hear about, the time they saw their buddy Cliff's guts get blown out on Okinawa or something like that. Well, that's not Vietnam, is it? That's World War II. You get my meaning that a story takes a lot of time and effort to construct, and there also has to be a presumption that there's a listening audience that is going to be receptive to that story. So just creating a safe space where anyone can write whatever they feel like doing in these workshops is what makes them so valuable. And we're not, plugging, saying you got to write your personal family history here, or share a traumatic secret or anything. But those things tend to come up, and people write about what's top of mind. The great thing about these workshops is you can always ignore the prompt and just write whatever the heck you want to write. So that's kind of where we're at as far as these workshops are concerned.
Yeah, I think the Vet House, so you mentioned the Veterans House, the Vet House helped the veterans from Vietnam share their secrets, because the others had secrets, and it was an ability to give back and get it out and to someone who would understand the tension of having to go kill those people, or be killed, or see death right at your feet. It was a good service company, and I guess when people finished telling those stories, there was some form of better feeling about life, and they disbanded.
Yeah, there was another project that I think it was certainly held at R25, that I did with Myrtle Stevens from Celebration Arts, Julia Connor, who was a poet,
Is.
And I think it was Julia Stagg was the visual artist. I was always, part of that as well. But this was homeless women, basically, that took a 3-year project. And the first year, they told stories. The second year, they expressed themselves through art. Because that is another way, art, music, and even dance. And then the third year, they did a theater production, am I right, that was actually performed
Correct.
there. And I thought, especially growing up in public housing myself, that inspired me to do other programs in public housing as a vehicle of telling stories to literally get people out of public housing and into other stuff, because they felt that they were so marginalized that was stopping them from working and doing the other projects. So I've always wanted to say that Ray has been an incubator of all of these programs. But what he's also done is taken stories that are normally hidden, and I'm going to name a few. Dorothea Puente, who was a serial killer. Do you want to?
No, it's just
Do you want to name some of the stories, the local
I just
stories?
commissioned the work. I tried to commission a play about Dorothea Puente in the early part of this century, and didn't get anywhere. And finally, I wrote a letter to a playwright in New York who had written plays about murderers and what they think and he said yes. And we got the play, and there was a line that went out through the parking lot into the street to see that play. And it was a complete sellout in December, and we didn't open it until at the end of January. So people were very interested in having, and in the line of the people who were going out to the street there, every 10th or 11th person had some kind of Dorothea Puente outfit on. Oh, I'm not kidding. There was something
wonderful production.
psychological about doing that play. Yeah.
And one thing, Marge is in the audience. She was Joan Didion, was it last month? Thank you very much for Joan Didion. But we're doing a production. I like bringing stories to life. That's the theater part. We're doing something called the Women of Poverty Bridge. So we're going to, and we're highlighting, Joan Didion isn't important. Eleanor McClatchy lived in the neighborhood as well. But the stories of people that no one's ever heard of. And the more we delve into things, and I did it just from who lived in my house, and it was always the men who had their stories told, right? When in reality, one of the women who was in my house, Rebecca Coulott, started the community chest. She started the Catholic Social Services. I found out that she owned most of where Frank Fats. She actually owned Frank Fats. She owned Beer's Bookstore. So she was large. And so, being able to tell the stories of everyday people, I think, is so important. And so I'm going to bring a question of, why do you choose poetry as a medium for telling your stories? I tend to use prose or nonfiction. My brothers say fiction. You do more, theater. You come to that one.
Absolutely.
So how do you choose your means of expressing on how you tell your personal story and the stories of others? Because you write fiction as well, and you might want to put a plug in for the book you're working on.
Well,
or not.
Yeah, it's not available, so I'm just giving away the goods if I talk about that. But yeah, poetry, I guess, has been the thing that comes most naturally to me to write. Because it's immediate expression of strong feelings, difficult feelings, or trying to come to terms with a new vocabulary that I had to learn. Like as a cancer patient, all these words come flying at you of things that they're going to do to you or put in your body, or things that you're doing. Like, for instance, vageling. I didn't know that I could vagal. But that's what happens when you have it's a vasovagal response and you faint because a certain nerve in your body has contracted and you lose consciousness. So that's what nurses called it when I would conk out, let's say when I was getting a blood drop. So anyway, so I wrote a poem in the style of Emily Dickinson to explain what vageling is and how it feels to vagal and how I feel about having vagaled multiple times. So yeah, poetry just came the easiest, I suppose, because I've been writing poetry since I was a teenager. And it's just kind of naturally what I gravitate to in moments of stress or moments of high emotion. I have to be pretty calm and pretty collected to write a narrative. It takes a lot of mental energy to enter into the sequence of cause and effect that produces a story that's satisfying. They can last an entire book. Most stories we tell last about 15 seconds. I said this, I did that, and boom, something happened or didn't happen. And it's almost like a joke, that a comedian might share. But longer stories are really challenging to write. So that's what I'm trying to work up to is how can I write a book-length story that's publishable that other people will care about and not just me. And that's taking me quite a while to work on. So I'm lazy, so I tend to write in the genre that I've written in since I was, first aware that I could write something as a teenager.
How about you?
I'm just what I said earlier in terms of the family. It goes back 3 or 4, I don't know, maybe even more generations back. That we're story actors. We act out the stories. And my grandmother and grandfather met as actors in the plays. And I've been to the various theaters that they acted in, even in Poland, in a place called Częstochowa, where my grandparents acted in a theater. I've been in that theater, and I get a sense of this family connection to that way of communicating ideas, communicating situations of people run into all kinds of dramatic moments in their life, physical and how people interact in life and get through from one difficulty to another. And it works. Theater works. That's it, that's the way that I find the strongest expression of what I do. Also, I like organizing other people to do those things too.
Well, and to piggyback a little bit on what Ray was saying, my sense of what poetry should be is it should be something that can be memorized and recited, performed in essence, in the exact same way that an actor performs words on a stage. Poetry is primarily an oral form, as I understand it, and it began as a way for poets to memorize long narratives through formal devices like rhyme or a certain type of rhythm that organized the sentences and was an aid to memory as well. So poetry is memorable speech that you can, sit in front of an audience and share. Like I could have probably recited 20 poems from that book, The Scars Aligned, because in my mind, they are kind of performance pieces. They have certain gestures associated with them. I try to perform them as an actor might perform them, and try not to just think about how awful it was when I was in that situation. But of course, that's hard to do when you're writing about your own story, really. You're retelling your own story. But yeah, I do think that poetry has that potential for a performance built into it because it is memorable. It is speech that, as I understand it and practice it, is meant to be memorized and then offered as words as a performance to a living audience who can react to it in the same immediate way that they can react to an actor's performance in the theater. I think that differs from a lot of poets who think of poetry as something that happens on the page. As one person wrote about William Carlos Williams, that's not poetry, that's typing. That's not writing, that's typing. It's just like words scattered on a page. And a lot of poets are terrible at performing their own work. I will say I was lousy before I had started memorizing it and truly understanding, what it was all about. And memorizing also helps me to understand what poems mean the most to me, and what poems are stronger than others. The poems that are memorable because they're better in some strange way, or I resonate more with them than I do with others that I wrote as well, and felt incredibly important, at the time. But then now I realize, that's not the finest poem I've ever written, and maybe those sentiments are not something I really share too much anymore. So anyway, there's that aspect of poetry too that I think, and I got my start as an actor really before I became a serious poet. I was acting in primary school and high school and in college, as we were discussing before. My last role was Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, where I had to memorize these long, dialogues that were kind of punishing at a certain point. A poem, at least, is fairly brief. At least the poems that I write are fairly brief and to the point, and then you move on to the next one. But yeah, there's still an actor inside of me anyway that wants to give the poem a life and a space to breathe in an actual audience surroundings.
So we're going to be opening this up to the audience if the audience has any more questions. And I hate to put both of you on the spot, but there's something I've always wanted to do. And one of my favorite performances to listen to, which is on radio now, but also see in person, is something called The Moth. And The Moth started in New York. It's now all around the United States. And it's basically, you're given a topic for 5 minutes. You can't do notes. And they use, sometimes it might be a writer, a musician, or almost anyone on a particular theme. And I thought that would be a wonderful performance to do at California Stage. But this seems like a great vehicle for being able to do a moth-type program. I don't know what word we would come up for here, Ted, but I think that it would be a great way of involving more people in the community and getting people to realize stories can be small. I noticed that when we were working on the cookbook and other projects I've done, I don't have a story, but everybody's got a 15-second anecdote that will usually go into a 2-minute story that'll go into a 5. So I'm hoping to involve both of you in that. I'm hoping that we can talk Brad into doing his, writing his healing program here as well. And Ray and Susan, of course. But is there any questions from the audience? Oh, we're going to get a microphone for you. Or a story from the audience that you want to share.
Yeah, Vietnam vets. Did you write a book about that in lifetime, or have you produced anything about him on paper?
Well, it's funny you should mention that. There's a poem in my most recent book about my transplant. The book is called Chimera, and there's a poem in there called My Vietnam War Movie. And this poem needs a little bit more introduction and context. But I am a war movie buff. I've always loved war movies, Vietnam movies in particular. And I went to a graft versus host disease patient symposium where I was put in a room with other patients who had had acute graft versus host disease. So we had barely survived our experience. And one of the patients said my room was like a war zone. And I was like, oh my God, he's right. That's what it felt like to me. First of all, I was blind during the worst of my graft versus host disease in the hospital. Somehow it attacked my eyes. My corneas got all scratched up, so I went blind for about a year and a half, which added a whole extra layer of confusion to my severe illness. So anyway, that phrase, a war zone, kind of preyed on my mind for a while until I finally wrote this poem. And you can, I'll let people guess what war movie I'm referring to in this piece. So this is called My Vietnam War Movie, and it's about my, the worst of my days in the bone marrow transplant unit. Another shot in the fevered dark, another backward stab at sleep. My bed was a disputed bridge between two fires where mortars raged all night and only the dawn brought stillness. On my right side was a jungle of tripwires and tubes leading up to a swiveling tower whose loaded guns aimed medication indiscriminately at insurgents and the innocent. On my left was a ridge of mountains, housing alternate intelligence, a neutral tribe with music and food on offer for when the conflict resolved into psychedelic introspection. I loved the violence, but hated the war with its bureaucratic moralism. I wanted to die, but not before I had claimed my victory over that state of emergency. I wanted a premature declaration to authorize one last celebration, fireworks at the surrendered stage, a charge of the helicopter brigade to airlift me from the rooftop pad of the hospital before the horde of onrushing admirers had converged to destroy me for good. In all that confusion, I had learned how to play a deranged God.
Heavy duty.
So Ted has.
No, but I love that movie too.
Yeah.
I have another poem about Deer Hunter, but I'll
If I can just add one thing about stories, James Scott from the Sacramento Room, he's been here quite often. In fact, we've done shows at the Sacramento Room, has a series that he's done with another man of maybe at least 15 stories of vets that he has collected that are wonderful. They're still doing those stories. So James Scott Sacramento Room, if you have a story to tell. The Library of Congress also has a lot of stories about Sacramento vets on their site. But one story is, you met Burnett Miller. You must
course.
have,
at the
because Burnett did
fundraising.
he did fundraising. He would open up his home to the Sacramento Poetry Center all the time.
Every year.
And I used to, be a fundraiser with him. I was a private chef for him, knew him for forever, but I was up in Portland seeing a Ken Burns story on World War II. And I was shocked when suddenly Burnett shows up in Sacramento to tell the story of being the very first person in an internment camp or in a concentration camp, a war of death.
Yeah.
Dachau, literally. And I thought that was another thing he never, in all the times that we had pretty intimate conversations, had never shared that story. And the fact that he was, doing that. So there are so many places in town that you can tell your story. I'm hoping to set up with Morning Coffee, I'm hoping to extend an hour, not online, to do a story station where if people want to share their stories, we'll record them. Later we can decide whether they're going to be videoed or not. So if you have a story to share, please continue on. Yeah, do you want to share it now? Sure. Great, we've got a microphone. Do you want to come where you're actually seen? Do you want to, or would you rather people didn't see you, or?
It doesn't matter.
Okay, you can come up here if you want. You can do it from there?
Yeah, all right.
Great, thank you.
Perfect.
Okay. My house with all my sisters, 6 sisters, and all their friends used to take in the vets every break. Somebody would come in, somebody would go out, come in and out. The house would fill up with hundreds of them, and we got a pool and all that, so they'd play with the pool and the girls. My sisters would invite all their friends. So, they really loved the Hamilton house. Yeah, it was a big deal. Yeah, and then when they finished, another batch would come in, okay. Hundreds of them at a time.
I'm going to ask you a question, those in the audience. What drew you to this program today that you wanted to come into the audience? And we have people at home watching this as well.
Oh, yeah. What drew me here was an open seat. Yeah. So I figured I'd sit down and listen. Yeah.
Great. So are there
Anyone
any
else?
more questions? And I'm going to give you guys time to wrap up.
Well, Ted was right that the movie I was playing off
Oh,
of was Apocalypse Now.
that's what I
Yeah.
figured.
So the helicopters, yeah, that they were a strong feature of that film.
And actually, if I can add into that, that's why the importance of, we're wordsmiths. We tend to tell stories and to write them down and to, I can't believe you can memorize all that. But there was a woman that I met her through ACC. So years ago, and ACC does remember that, we got a grant for something called the Senior Community Legacy Quilt. And we would get together with seniors and young people and put together a quilt where you had a quilt square. Joy, who's in the audience, participated in this as well. And one woman did a square that was very disturbing. And I won't tell you quite yet what it was. And so we didn't put it into the quilt, but we went back to her later and asked if she wanted to share her story. And so the story she said, well, what I'd like to do is to do my own quilt. And she came back with the quilt. She was 4 years old. She had grown up in Italy during the war. Her father was the mayor, and this is not by words. This is all through art that she expressed it. Her father had been the mayor, and one day he came home and he had all of his extremities broken, both legs and his arm. And the story she wanted to tell was what it was like to be an Italian in Italy during the war, and then her fear of coming to America and how she would be perceived after the war. Using art as an expression. In that instance, you would never have gotten that story out. And I'm very proud to say that she's now a Renaissance Society member. She took the memoir class there and is now writing up the story herself and sharing it. So again, we're going to wrap it up. Tell your story however you need to tell your story. If it's through photography. Are you going to add on to that one, Marge?
I just want to say how much you inspired me, all three of you.
Oh,
you know, my family doesn't know anything about me. I mean, yeah, there's Grandma March from North Dakota, lived on a farm, but they don't know about my great-grandfather who came from Dublin. I'm half Irish. My other grandfather who came from Oslo, Norway. And you know, I don't have to write a book, but I do. You've inspired me to get on that computer and leave these stories, because there will be a day when perhaps I won't even be here, but they'll say, I didn't know that about Grandma Marge.
Right.
So I thank you very much. It's been a wonderful opportunity for me.
Thank you. Can I respond to that?
Yeah, of course. I want you both to
You're
wrap
not
up.
always near your computer, and I have had trouble remembering events, and I'll be walking down the street, and I'll go, oh yeah, that's the end of that little event. And so I've taken to one of these. It's just a little book. I'll write it in, and then I put it back, and then I finally open it back up and go, oh yeah, the end of that is, oh no, that's not the end, that's the end. Wait, no, I'm adding here, what? Oh yeah, and then it went over to, so this could be a very valuable thing to carry around and then put it on the computer.
That is true. And one thing before I throw it over to Brad, when my husband was in hospice, he was lucky enough to have a chaplain that came with him. He wasn't a religious person, but they would write poetry, which he had never done in all the time I'd known him, or he would tell his life story. And I have 80 hours of tapes of him. The one thing he always wanted to do, and Ray knew him well, he always said that he thought he was a comedian, but he was really a tragedian. The importance for him of getting his story out, because his kids don't care. And his stories that he told were never, seldom about him, but he wanted to make sure that the story of his mother, who had been a concubine during the Turkish genocide of the Armenians, and I mean, that's a nice word, right? She was raped repeatedly by, the Kurds and Turks, and was the only survivor of 300 people, that her story get out. But he didn't want just his story out in a book form. He wants it with what's called an ISBN number at the end.
Oh, that's right.
Because he wants his story to be at the Library of Congress.
Absolutely.
He wants her story to be there. What I could do before he died was to contact the story station that they were doing through PBS. So he was able to tell his story. We went to San Francisco, even though we were sick 45 minutes, have it on disc. That disc is now not only at the Library of Congress, his mother's story, and his father's story as well, but it's at the Holocaust Museum, it's at the Armenian thing. We might think that our stories aren't important. They might not be important to the next generation, but they're going to be important to other people as well. So any way that you can get your story down, do it. And Brad, we're going to,
You said that.
yeah.
I think it's important. Many families say they're not interested in that, but maybe the next generation is,
Right.
or the next generation. And what's this book I found? Like, oh, it's written by my great-grandmother.
But I'm going to use this one. This book isn't just important. This book is important to the Polish community. The stories that they tell are absolutely universal. One of the stories that I tell in my book is about my father being a hobo, basically, as a kid on the road. And what I didn't realize that when he was out on the road from 8 to 10, there were 250,000 kids. This is 1919 to 1921. This is long before the boxcar children of the Depression. 250,000 kids between the age of 8 to 10 were on the road or in rail cars working as migrant child laborers all across the country. So to me, it wasn't just his story. I then wanted to collect stories from other people who shared similar kinds of experiences. Those are important historic documents that those stories need to be preserved. So don't just think about your family, and just think of what's the broader implication of your story. So Brad, you get to be the end closer.
Wow. That's a big responsibility. Well, I guess I would kind of piggyback on what you've just said, Maryellen, to say that, we live in an age where people, for whatever reason, want to deny some historical facts. For instance, the Holocaust, or also the Armenian genocide, which you've just referred to, which Hitler used as inspiration for his own genocidal efforts, because he said, well, nobody cares about the Armenians, right? Nobody remembers that. So we have historical records and evidence of the genocides that did occur. But what seems to matter to people, though, is the stories. Because a photograph can say certain things about what may have transpired or what people looked like in a certain situation. But it's the stories that people tell, the books that people have written about these events that tend to stick with us as human beings, because we don't just want facts, we want meaning. And that's what stories can provide best of all, it seems to me, is meaning. Things that we can, relate to or imagine ourselves in those situations, when a lot of these things are simply unimaginable without stories. So I think it's a human universal need for meaning that drives the impulse to tell stories, to listen to stories, and to think in terms of story. So thank you, Maryellen.
Well, great, thank you. And again, this is going to be on YouTube. Thank everybody for coming, everybody in the audience, to Morning Coffee. We do these once a month on the first Wednesday. In July 5th, we'll be here for festas, festivals, and fairs. And it's going to be the history. The reason we picked that topic is we're going to have lots of things coming up. But it's also the story of the immigrants. Most of them have come. So we're going to be talking about the Croatian ones, the Japanese Oban Festival, the festas and the Portuguese, the Cortland Pear Fair, et cetera. And also give you an idea of what you can do for the summer. And then one last, lots of plugs for ACC. Please give money to ACC. If you're enjoying this, there's no charge for any of the lifelong learning programs. I would usually be out at Mahjong. I love coming to the bingo things. I sign up for almost every class I can. There's a newsletter that you can sign up for. And again, one last plug for the California State Railroad Museum on Monday. You can find anything you need on accsv.org. We'll list all of the classes and programs. There's going to be tours, and come back to morning coffee. And if you have a topic you want us to cover, please let us know. So thank you.
Thank you.
And
you,
to
Mary.
Sean and the rest of the group, thank you. So we
Thank
just
you,
talked for a
Maryellen.
couple minutes.
Very